All right, guys. So I wanted to start out. The first unit talks about viruses and evolution, and the focus when the textbook was developed about a year ago was on influenza A. And obviously, you guys don't want to talk about influenza. The topic that's on everybody's mind right now is the coronavirus and COVID 19. And so, while you do have some material on influenza A and evolution in the textbook, I wanted to post a lecture here and just kind of summarize kind of where we're at with our understanding of COVID 19 and the coronavirus. So, hopefully, this answers some questions that you might have. I understand you'll probably have others as well. And please post those in the discussion forum and we'll go through and talk about them. So let me go ahead and just get started. So again, just to kind of give you an idea about sort of my background coming into this course, um, I've actually been doing a lot of work with materials on COVID-19. My background is actually in microbiology, so my PhD is in virology. I worked on a different virus, hepatitis B virus, for my doctorate. And then I've also been teaching and developed our public health course that we teach at the college. And so I've been working on putting together a lot of material for COVID 19, and that's where this lecture comes in. So, first of all, I just wanted to have you think about okay, so we have a period of time where we have a new virus that appears sort of out of nowhere with unknown origins. Millions of people are infected, right? We have a global pandemic. Many people have mild symptoms, others are pretty sick with pneumonia, transmission through respiratory droplets, right? We have masks that are being recommended, quarantine, distancing are emphasized. Okay, what are we talking about? We're not talking about 2020, we're talking about the year 1918. Okay, so these types of pandemics have occurred before. This is not a new thing. Okay, these are pictures from 1918, right? So you'll notice people are wearing masks. This woman working at her job typing, wearing a mask. These women are making masks, right? So you see this guy is being denied entrance because he's not wearing a mask. Okay, so we've been here before, and this is not the first global pandemic. Right now, we're a little over 300,000 deaths from COVID 19 globally, right? About over 100,000 deaths in the US. But you'll see that compared to some other global pandemics that we have gone through as a globe, the number of deaths are actually pretty small, right? So we've had influenza outbreaks that have killed millions of people. H1N1 in 1918 is probably the worst, so somewhere between 25 and 50 million deaths. And keep in mind that our global population was much smaller at that point. It'd be equivalent to more like 300 million people dying today. Okay, so yeah, we have done this, and so I guess my main message is we will get through this just like we got through these other global pandemics, and we just have to sort of do our best to maintain vigilance on the things that we need to do, wearing masks and keeping distance, until hopefully we can get a treatment or vaccine developed for this, and we'll go through what's being done on that in a few minutes. So here's really what I wanted to talk about today. The origin of the virus, how it's related to other viruses, what do we know about the virus and the disease, potential treatments and vaccine developments, and then we'll kind of talk about how this might end, where we're headed later this year with it. First of all, one of the most important things to talk about is misinformation. And there is an incredible amount of misinformation. Anytime you have a new disease, a new virus like this, there's a vacuum. We just don't have a lot of answers. And so unfortunately that gets filled with misinformation or people that have an agenda. Um, and so I just caution you to be very careful about some of the information that you're seeing, because there is a lot of misinformation. A lot of the stuff that you see on Facebook and other social media is wrong. Um, and whether that's somebody trying to sell something or somebody that has some other motivation. It really varies. But just keep in mind, this is just an example of some of the misinformation that we see, and this does have real consequences. I mean, there are a number of cellular towers in the UK that people destroyed because they thought that there was a link between 5G cellular networks and coronavirus. Okay, no, there is no link between those things. Um, there's just so much misinformation, right? People are concerned that wearing a mask means you're going to reinfect yourself with the virus if you're sick or things like that. And no, that's not the case. So just keep in mind, this is a nice acronym that I found, SHEEP. Okay, think about this when you're looking at information that you come across, right? The S stands for source, the H for history, the E for evidence, E for emotion, and P for pictures, right? So think about where this is coming from. Okay, what is the history behind it? What is the evidence that this, is there a source mentioned? Does they say where they got their information from? Right? Are they trying to be sort of inflammatory or divisive in the language that they're using? So think about the emotion part of it, and then pictures, right? What is that an accurate image that was used, right? So there were oftentimes early on there were pictures that were used that were claimed to be from the COVID-19 pandemic that were in fact from other previous pandemics or other things. So we just have to be very careful about where our information is coming from. Okay, so first of all, what are the origins of the virus? Well, this information is changing all the time, but our best understanding right now of where things came from is this was a coronavirus is the family name of viruses. So there are lots of different coronaviruses that are out there, thousands of different coronaviruses. There are several other species of coronavirus that can infect humans. In fact, being infected with a coronavirus is not that uncommon. It's estimated about a third of the common cold cases are caused by different species of coronavirus. We've got about 6 other species specifically of coronavirus that have been known to infect humans. Some of the biggest outbreaks are in 2003. We had the SARS pandemic, which you may have heard of that before. It stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. It again originated probably from bats and spread to humans and ended up killing several thousand people. We also had an outbreak of Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, MERS, in 2010. This again was a virus that came from bats. It was spread to camels, and then from camels, humans were infected. And again, not very many cases. The case rate was pretty low, but the death rate was actually very high for that virus, somewhere around 20 to 40%. So there's been different coronaviruses that have jumped from humans. The best guess right now is that this was a virus that originated in something called a horseshoe bat that existed in China. And this virus went through another animal because many of the viruses, when people survey and look at viruses in these horseshoe bats, they are not capable of infecting humans. So probably this virus went to another animal. The best guess is something called a pangolin, which is a very odd looking animal. Google it and check it out. It probably jumped into that because we know there are viruses in pangolins that do have the ability to infect humans. And so it might have picked up the ability to infect human cells in the pangolin and then probably was transmitted to humans at a live animal market in the city of Wuhan, China, sometime in late 2019, probably November of 2019. But that's not for sure because there are people in Wuhan that got infected with the virus that never went to a market. So we don't really know. But that's our best understanding of it right now. And again, from there, from Wuhan, that's where we had the first cases. no evidence that the virus has been genetically engineered in any way or was created in a laboratory. There's been a lot of misinformation about that. There's simply no evidence to support that. It really seems like this is a virus that came from nature, was in bats, and then was transmitted eventually to humans. And obviously from there, we know what has happened. So this is from a couple weeks ago. The global death rate has continued to go up. Like I said, we're well over 300,000 deaths globally. That's probably a definite undercount of how many people have actually died. There's probably a lot of people that have died from related causes that were influenced by COVID-19 that just weren't identified. And so, again, the case count I'm sure is low, and we'll talk about why that is in a minute. But keep in mind that there are some overlaps with influenza, but there are a lot of differences as well. So it is a virus similar to influenza, but in many ways they're very different. So influenza, we typically have 1 to 4 days after exposure, you start to get sick. For COVID-19, that seems to be a lot greater. Typically, it's more like 3 to 5 days, but up to 14 days, people can experience symptoms. The more severe respiratory complications we typically don't see with influenza as much as we're seeing with COVID-19. So it seems like about 20% of people that get infected with the new coronavirus. And by the way, when people use the term novel coronavirus, what they mean is this specific virus has never infected humans before. So this is a newly evolved virus to be able to infect humans, okay, which is why it's called a novel coronavirus. Now, like I said, we don't have really any good prevention other than the things that you guys have all heard of: social distancing, wearing masks, those sorts of things. It's pretty much just avoiding contact with other people. We don't have a flu shot. We don't have a vaccine yet. We do not have good treatments. We'll talk about what we know about treatments in a few minutes. So it's a little bit different from influenza. All right, so we know a lot about the virus already, and there's been a tremendous amount of research that's been done in a very short period of time on the virus itself. It's probably more infectious, so that means it spreads easier than influenza does. Our best guess is that every person that gets infected might infect somewhere around 2 other people. Okay, but that number is highly variable on a number of different factors. We have sequenced the virus, and we know that it looks very similar to the virus that caused SARS and MERS, but it is slightly different. It has a little bit, a couple different proteins that it has acquired in its viral genome, and so that means that it's a little bit different than those viruses, and we'll talk about how that is in a little bit. So the death rate probably somewhere around 0.5%. Again, it's hard to estimate considering there are a lot of people that have probably had it that didn't know they've had it. So we'll talk about that more in a minute about the disease. But it's somewhere around 0.5%, which is quite a bit higher than influenza. Influenza has a death rate of about 0.1%. So it is definitely higher than influenza. Okay, so here's the key thing. When you want to try to understand how this virus causes the symptoms that it does, we need to think about how do viruses work, right? And in the chapter that you guys are going to read, you're going to get some nice background about how viruses work. But basically, they cannot replicate on their own. They have to go inside of another cell. They have to go inside of a human cell and sort of take that cell over. In order to be able to get into the cell, the cell has to have the appropriate receptor for that virus. And so in this case, the receptor is a protein called ACE2 or ACE2. Okay, and so any cell, presumably that has ACE2 on its surface, would be able to bind with the proteins that are on the surface of the virus, and the virus then would be able to get into the cell and take it over and start replicating and basically make more viruses. That's pretty much what they do. So when we think about what are the cells in the body that have this ACE2 receptor on their surface, it makes a lot of sense why we're seeing the types of symptoms that we do, right? So we know that this is primarily a respiratory disease, and we know that the alveoli in the lungs have a lot of ACE2 on their cells. And so that makes sense that the virus is able to get into those cells. Some other very new data suggests that the virus might be able to get into the bloodstream and infect cells lining the arteries, which would be very unique for a virus and could explain some of the symptoms that we're seeing. We also have heart cells, kidney cells, which is why people that have heart problems, high blood pressure, diabetes are people that are more likely to get severe disease or succumb to the disease, probably because the virus is able to get into some of those blood vessels or some of those organs. And then we also notice that people have a lot of gastrointestinal problems. People typically have diarrhea and things like that. And a lot of the cells that line our gut, our intestines, also have this ACE2 receptor. So that makes a lot of sense why we're seeing these sorts of symptoms for the virus. So one of the key things to remember is that somewhere between 25 and maybe 35% of all cases are asymptomatic, meaning the person has no symptoms, but yet they carry just as much virus in their respiratory tract as somebody who might be really sick with the disease. Okay, so only about, like we said, 75-80% are asymptomatic at all. Many people have mild symptoms that they don't even, really think about it. They might have a real minor cough. They might have a runny nose. Nothing that rises to the level of needing to, go to the doctor or get checked out. And that's why, like I said, the case count of how many people have had this is probably really low. There's probably a lot more people that have had it than we recognize, because what you're seeing there when I put those numbers up, those are confirmed cases, right? So somebody that had mild signs and symptoms probably didn't go to the doctor, didn't get tested, wouldn't know. So like I said, a lot of the things we're seeing, so we're seeing blood clots, we're seeing damage to the heart and kidneys, people that have pre-existing conditions, so they have things like diabetes, high blood pressure, things like that, are going to be more likely to experience severe disease with COVID-19. The other thing that we're seeing is many of the people that really go downhill quickly and really have issues with their pneumonia in their lungs, oftentimes this is from an overreaction of the immune system. So we also have sort of a hyperactive immune response that can occur, something called a cytokine storm, which some people have used that term, which can lead to many symptoms, not necessarily from the virus, but actually from the immune response, from the immune system trying to fight off the virus. So that's another thing people are looking at for potential treatments. Also, we're seeing a few cases of a new syndrome that are seen in some children. So children typically do not get very sick when they get infected with COVID-19. It seems like they get infected pretty much across all age ranges. You can get infected, but they very rarely have severe disease. But there is this new syndrome that people are seeing some different rashes and some swelling and things like that in children that might be an immune response. People aren't really sure. That's something people are still exploring. So here's the key thing to keep in mind is when we look at infections, right? So we see infections across all age ranges. So everybody can get infected, right? But the death rate really increases with age. So you see here 0 to 17, only 0.04% of deaths are people that are 0 to 17. 18 to 44 is, again, a much smaller percentage. Okay, we've got somewhere around 23% for 45, and you'll see that the biggest one is right here, 47%. We've got 75 and older. Okay, now you'll notice if you look closely, there is a section of the pie piece that is shaded. Those are the people that had pre-existing conditions. So you'll notice that The biggest risk factors are people that are older and people that have those pre-existing conditions. People that have heart disease, people that have high blood pressure, people that have diabetes. They are much more likely to be the ones who end up dying from COVID-19, as you can see from this illustration. So you'll notice that the majority of these pie pieces are shaded, meaning the majority of people in all age ranges that have died from COVID-19 are people that have pre-existing conditions. It's also been noticed, and this is pretty consistent, that COVID-19 is slightly more common in men. And that could be because they have more ACE2 receptors, could be for another reason. People don't really know. All right, so the last couple of things I wanted to talk about, potential treatments. And there's basically two different approaches that you can take for treatments for COVID-19. You can think about how do we stop the replication and spread of the virus, or is there a way for us to slow down the immune response, kind of tamp down that immune response to the virus, or do both, right? So we've got dozens of drugs that are currently in clinical trials that are being tested. We don't have very much data yet on any of them. And so it's premature. There really isn't any good data to suggest that there's really anything that's going to have a real big impact. Probably the closest thing we have is a drug called remdesivir, which is a drug that stops the spread of the virus. It basically stops the virus from being able to replicate. And there is some initial data that suggested that when that's given to people that have more severe forms of the disease, it does shorten the time of their illness. So a couple days less. But it doesn't make a big difference, it seems, in death rates. And it certainly doesn't have a huge impact. So it's probably not a game changer, as they would say, but a drug that might be helpful for some people. And we just don't know enough. There's been some thought on chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine. There's just no evidence really that that is an effective treatment, and there seems to be significant side effects with that drug. The data suggests people often get heart arrhythmias and things like that. So there are some pretty significant side effects, and very little evidence that chloroquine really does much to stop the infection. Doesn't seem to stop infection at all, and doesn't seem to really change the course of disease. Another thing that people are really interested in is something called convalescent plasma. So can we take plasma from people who have recovered? Can we take the antibodies from their blood and use that to kind of help neutralize the virus? Again, we don't really know whether that works yet, but there are several studies that are underway that are testing that. So we don't really have a good picture on treatment yet. Treatment for viral diseases in general is really hard because they are living inside of our cells. So it's very difficult to get things into our cells, and it's very difficult to target the virus without killing our own cells. But there's a lot of work under people that are doing right now and trying to figure this out. The other thing is vaccine development. So again, there's over 100 vaccines that are in development right now. And we need to understand that this process takes time because we have to go through several different phases of a clinical trial in order to get to a safe vaccine. And that's really the key thing to keep in mind, is that we need to deliver something to people that is going to be safe. And so there are a number of studies that are just getting going, that are sort of in the initial phase, the phase 1, where really the only thing they look at is safety. They don't really care whether the vaccine works. They want to make sure there's no side effects, there's no issues that people get when they get the vaccine. So that's underway right now. We're just starting to see a couple moving into phase 2, where they're looking at the efficacy of the vaccine. And the initial data, it suggests that we are seeing an immune response. We are seeing the immune system recognize the vaccine and start to produce antibodies, which is really good. That's what we need to see, because the antibodies are what is going to neutralize when our bodies see the real virus, if we ever get exposed to it. That's kind of how vaccination works, is that we sort of prime our immune system to be ready to look for that organism, so that then when we see the real deal, our immune system recognizes it and gets rid of it without us ever even knowing we were infected. So that is being currently done. We're checking to see whether this works in a small number of patients, and there's a couple different uh, early pieces of information that suggest that this is going well. It definitely seems possible that we could have something by the end of the year. Now, how many doses of that would be available is another whole question, another whole issue. But it is really important that people take their time. And I know that people are saying, why is this taking so long? Why is this taking? I mean, we have to understand that normally the vaccine development process takes years to get a vaccine rolled out. And so we're trying to do this in record speed here. And what we don't want to have happen is this get rolled out and then we recognize that there's some safety issues with it. Other vaccines that have been worked on actually lead to something called immune enhanced disease, where when they prime the immune system, it actually has the opposite effect. Instead of getting rid of it, it actually leads to worse disease. And so we have to be very careful when we are working on these vaccines that we're not getting that sort of response. And so that's why it is going to take some time to see how this works and see how effective it is. But I think the initial responses have been encouraging. So this is the key thing, right? And this is the last thing I wanted to talk about in a few minutes is how do we prevent the spread without an effective treatment or vaccine? The key thing is really distancing and masks, right? Any sort of a mask seems to be better than no mask. So it doesn't need to be a fancy N95 or just a cloth mask will prevent really two things that you need to keep in mind. That it's important not only from the perspective of picking up virus from somebody else, but also if you are one of those asymptomatic people that you have a lot of virus but you don't know it, then it also prevents you from spreading the virus to other people. So the mask is really important. We also need to keep in mind that it's a time and number of viral particles. So the more time you are standing by somebody, right, then if they're coughing, if they're sneezing, even if they're talking or breathing, they could be releasing some virus if they're not wearing a mask. And so brief contacts are not going to be as big of a problem, right? So you walk by somebody at Meijer, that's not going to be a problem. Standing right next to somebody, sitting right next to somebody like in a restaurant for a long period of time, that's where you have the possibility for spread. And this image over here is from a study that was done in China in February, in late January, and they showed that this person in yellow here was sitting at this restaurant. The airflow was going from right to left and sort of circulating in this part of the room, and you can see how many people sitting in this area got infected, right? Just sitting down for a couple hours having a meal with these people. All the people over here that were not in the airflow, none of them got infected, right? So this is the key thing, is the longer contacts increases your chance of spread. Also, indoor versus outdoor. Keep in mind that if you're outside, that reduces the risk quite a bit as well. So if you can, as much as possible, keep that distance, 3 to 6 feet. That's going to make a difference. Wear the mask. Try to be outside as much as possible. And then the other key side of it is the testing and contact tracing. So we have to be able to have effective testing so that we can find where we do start to get outbreaks, especially as things are starting to open up now, right? The country has been under lockdown. It's starting to open up. We're starting to go back to restaurants and businesses again. And so when we do have outbreaks, which inevitably we will, we need to be able to effectively test people and then also do this thing called contact tracing, where you basically talk to that person who's sick and say, okay, tell me all the people you've come in contact with in the last 2 days. And you go out and you find those people and you say to them, hey, you might be sick. You need to quarantine yourself. Who have you come in contact with? You go find those people, you quarantine them. That's how the process goes. That's what we need to be able to do to try to keep this under control. Antibody testing, I'm not going to really talk about because those tests are not really reliable yet. And we don't even know whether the presence of antibodies makes any difference in reinfection or not, or how long those antibodies are good for. We simply don't know. So that's still an open question. All right, so how does this end? A couple different possibilities. The virus might become less pathogenic over time. As it's around, it might just sort of become one of these viruses that are just around, kind of like influenza, but becomes less pathogenic over time. We might get a vaccine. I would say we probably have 3 months away from starting to get a real good sense of that, and potentially 12 months before we would have significant doses available. People talk about herd immunity. That is unlikely to happen. Okay, herd immunity is the idea that we have enough people infected that had an antibody response that the virus simply couldn't spread in the community. You'd have to have 60 to 70% of the people in our country infected with the virus in order to get that to happen. Right now, that's at about 3 to 5%. So not very likely that's going to happen. So basically, we need to keep doing what we're doing. Temperature checks, masks required. Anybody that's experiencing some of those symptoms associated with that, make sure that they are quarantining themselves, and then do that contact tracing. That's really going to be the key. So I hope you guys found this helpful. And like I said, I look forward to seeing your questions on the discussion board.